That way that won't show up once everybody else gets on here. And then when I hit broadcast, I'll just wait a few, just about 30 seconds or so everybody can log in. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the third conversation in the Dear White People Dialogue Series. This initiative is sponsored by the Department of Educational Studies and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Global Engagement, both within the College of Education and Human Ecology at The Ohio State University. The purpose of this dialogue series is to engage contemporary scholars on critical questions about whiteness and white supremacy in education, as well as strategies for disrupting rampant anti-Blackness in education and in organizations. Each conversation has revolved around a guiding question, and the question for this session is, it's okay to be white, but can you also be anti-racist? We began the series defining whiteness and anti-Blackness, and although previous speakers have touched on this, our panelists today will be talking to us about what exactly is anti-racism and what does it mean to be anti-racist. We want to welcome those of you who have been present for our previous series. And so, as I mentioned, the first webinar was what is whiteness and white supremacy in education and how does it fuel anti-Blackness. Our second session was what is the role of white people in dismantling whiteness in education and challenging anti-Blackness. The third one, which is today, it's okay to be white, but can you also be anti-racist in educational spaces? And we hope you'll join us for our final webinar in the series that's next week, which the question surrounding that one is, how do you show up for your Black colleagues in schools and on campuses? First of all, before we move forward, I want to make a couple of acknowledgments. I want to thank Dr. Lori Patton Davis, who is a professor in higher education and student affairs at The Ohio State University, and she's also department chair of educational studies in EHE. I also want to thank Dr. Stephen Quay, who is an associate professor in HESA, higher education and student affairs in the Department of Educational Studies. And I'd also like to thank Rhodesia McMillian, who is one of our Dean's Diversity Postdoctoral Fellows in Educational Studies and Educational Policy, who has also been helping to run the Q&A format of these sessions. So now I'm going to turn it over and ask each panelist to briefly introduce themselves. And my panelists, for your introduction, if you wouldn't mind stating your name, your preferred pronouns, your institutional affiliation, and share what you want listeners to know about you and your work.
Good afternoon, everyone. Frank Tuitt, University of Denver, professor of higher education, and for at least a couple more weeks at DU, and then I'll be transitioning to a new role as vice president and CDO at the University of Connecticut. What is one thing I want people to know about me? I've been doing this work for a while. I guess for the last 7 years, I've been in the role of a senior administrator and trying to help institutions think more consciously, critically, and intentionally about how to help Black folks move in, move through, and move out of our institution in ways that leave them intact.
Thank you, Dr. Matias. What about you?
Hi, good afternoon. Oh, good morning. Afternoon for my East Coasters. I'm coming from LA, so good morning for my West Coasters. My name is Cheryl Matias. I just finished an associate professor post at the University of Colorado, but I did do a visiting facultyship at University of Denver, so it's nice to see my colleague and my mentor and just my homie in Denver there. I am accepting a position as a professor and director of secondary teacher education at the University of Kentucky, Wildcat. And I go by she, her, and I'm a mother scholar of 3. And I guess something I'd want you to know is that it's really hard to be graceful to yourself in a time that has always been urgent, right? And you've got this urgency with respects to racial justice. You've got this urgency in terms of transformational education. And at the same time, those of us mother scholars, we have this urgency to mother and care for our children and then love our children in a loveless society. So I think the one thing I really want us to know is just be graceful with ourselves, and the work is never done, which is great. We still have a job, you know? So thank you so much for having me, the Ohio State, and for inviting me. Davis.
Dr. Welton.
Hi, yes, so I hear there's lots of transitions and moves to new institutions. My name is Anjalé Welton, but my nickname is AJ, so welcome to call me AJ. Preferred pronouns she, her, hers. And for the last 9.5 years, I've been a faculty member at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, as an associate professor, and I am making the transition right now to the University of Wisconsin-Madison as professor. And something to share about my work. Myself and my co-author Sarah Deem, who at University of Missouri, I want to give a shout out to her because she made full professor. So congrats to Sarah. We had a book that just came out last week called Anti-Racist Educational Leadership and Policy.
So thank you to all of those introductions. And in our chat, I was kind of looking at the chat and laughing because a lot of people are giving our panelists shout outs who are from your universities. I do want to deal with a piece of housekeeping before we go on. To our audience, if you'll please use the Q&A feature to pose questions. Some of the answers to those questions will be provided in the Q&A feature. And so we'll get to as many as we can during the Q&A portion of the panel. Also, some of you have asked about the previous videos from the webinar series, and these are being edited, and we'll have these up as soon as possible. So I did want to turn your attention to please check back on our Equity, Diversity, and Global Engagement webpage and on our EDGE YouTube channel. And so we will post those in the chat box if you have questions about that. So, let's jump right into it. I'll start with you, Dr. Tuitt. How can an anti-racist standpoint address rampant anti-Blackness in education? And what are some of the examples of that?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, we are jumping right in it too. I guess for me, a couple of things. When I think about an anti-racist standpoint, it involves an awareness, an understanding of the history, pervasiveness, salience of race and racism in higher education. And most importantly for me, a rejection of race neutral or colorblind sort of approaches to thinking about how to create inclusive and equitable campus environments. And I've been thinking about this specifically in our current context as it relates to anti-Blackness, because it's clear to me that over time our traditionally white institutions have been creating what I'm referring to as a sort of suffocating environment that requires Black folks expend a significant amount of energy to navigate institutional environments. So we're trying to just live, to thrive, and to survive in these environments that that don't really understand how to support us. And I've been focusing most recently on the impacts of our diversity and inclusion efforts, considering my role. I feel like it's been one way in which we've sort of implemented diversity and inclusion practices in superficial ways that result in the furthering of an anti-Black sentiment. And I'll give one example of that. Over time, we saw a shift away from Black cultural centers to multicultural centers, which seemed to be an appropriate thing to do to have a more expanded or inclusive approach to supporting diversity efforts on in our institutions. And in the places where that happened, I think one unintended consequence perhaps is that we moved away a structure, an infrastructure that was specific to centering Blackness. And by doing that, we eliminated one of the protections that was in place to fight against this anti-Black sentiment. So for me, we need to move towards a notion of recentering Blackness. It's been good to see that, and to really think critical about the ways in which we approach our diversity, equity, and inclusion practices. I'll stop there and come back to this later if we have time.
Thank you so much for that. And I apologize for the pause, audience, just trying to make sure that we cut down on feedback by muting myself. Dr. Welton, in one of your articles, you discuss how some institutional anti-racist practice is often not operationalized to specifically address how to take action against racism. What should good anti-racist practice entail?
I think going back to Dr. Tuitt's comment that there, is often a lot of talk, but not, not real traction. And I think, institutions have good intentions to be anti-racist in theory and in ideology, and it's not enough to just say I'm anti-racist, but there needs to be evidence of it in your everyday practice and your everyday actions. And you also need to do this work systemically. And I think that, so I don't think there's like one good way of doing it, but I think one wrong way of doing it is to, not do the work in our everyday actions and not try to change the entire system and work on the entire system as a whole. I think a big fatal flaw from educational leaders from K-12, onto higher ed is that they try to approach this work very piecemeal and just focus on one little component of the problem at a time. But anti-racism is systemic work because racism, manifests systemically. And so you need to try to tackle all of it. You need to try to work on the mindsets and the attitudinal changes through the professional development work, but don't professional development the heck out of everything to the point where that's all you do is professional development work, right? You also then need to focus on the norms aspect and work on questioning your institutional norms and long established habits and practices. You also need to focus on the structural aspects, like what structures and policies do we have in place and how do they marginalize certain groups but privilege others. And then also the relational aspect, right? Like how do we interact with one another? And that's where the microaggressions come to play, et cetera. So I think the big issue is that oftentimes we just try to work on one small component of the issue when we need to approach it systemically. Also, I think in terms of what good anti-racism looks like is also focusing more so on the humanity of folks of color and focusing on their care. I think similar to what Dr. Tuitt just mentioned, I think with anti-racist work, we spend a lot of time on trying to address the resistance and pushback from white folks and trying to get them to care about the issue, get them to want to see that the issue is a problem. We put a lot of our energy into that. And I think that is a big no. Like, we need to focus on putting our energy and care into supporting folks of color, getting their perspectives, their feedback, because they're the ones that are impacted by the policy. So I'm gonna be quiet and you can move on to the next question.
No, thank you so much. And so I do want to follow up with Dr. Tuitt. Dr. Tuitt, you've written about a framework of reconstructing institutions as anti-racist. So how might we promote anti-racist practices in schools and on campuses? So for instance, is it a matter of renaming buildings and removing statues? Are these merely symbolic gestures? But what does real change look like from an institutional level to address anti-Blackness?
So we've seen a lot of movements to rename buildings and remove statues, and I will say that is an important, perhaps, first step. It is also symbolic in a lot of ways, and I think for me, it's an important first step in sort of beginning to remove some of the vestiges of our plantation past. I've been thinking a lot about the ways in which the current sort of construction of higher ed institutions embody a lot of the tools and technologies from our plantation past. And so removing some of these direct connections to that is important. Now, it doesn't really get to the root causes of things that are embedded in our system structures and policies and practices. And so we have to also begin to dismantle those things that facilitate and further anti-Blackness in our institutions. I've been thinking about 4 particular types of investments that would serve as evidence of real change for me. And I think investments are good ways to think about it, because our institutions have been engaged in divesting from centering Blackness in a lot of different ways. And so I think there's a unique opportunity for us to reinvest in centering Black. The first is the one we typically land on, that's stepping up our efforts to recruit, retain, and respect Black students, Black employees, Black board members, Black vendors, Black community partners. So really engaging the Black community in meaningful ways. Thinking about the ways in which we can invest in knowledge production, whether that's curriculum, research, program services that center the production of knowledge for, by, and about Black people. That would be my second investment. The third is, and this was referenced earlier, Dr. Welton talked about this, investment in professional development opportunities, accountability practices, overall infrastructure that builds individual and institutional capacity to create inclusive and affirming and equitable campus environments where Black members in the community can experience a powerful sense of belonging and have healthy engagement with other minoritized communities across campus. So really investing in the social development of Black communities on campus. And then, that's the third, and I mentioned the fourth as well, is related to really unpacking our policies and practices and overall infrastructure that build an inclusive, affirming, and equitable campus environment. So 4 investments there. Again, invest in the compositional diversity of our communities, particularly with an emphasis on Blackness. We often do this thing where we highlight that our diversity numbers are going up and not recognizing that our numbers of Black folks are going down at the same time. And so we really got to be careful about that and be transparent about that. Thinking about curriculum that centers, again, Black folks and the Black experience, build opportunities to create a Black community. And then the fourth is really around developing the competencies for inclusion so that all employees have the opportunity to deliver on the promises that our institutions make regarding diversity, equity, and inclusion. So when I see those 4 in place, and I'm sure there are others, then I will believe real change has occurred.
Thank you so much for that specificity, Dr. Tuitt. I think that's some of the feedback that we've been hearing from some of the folks who've been participating in this. So really appreciate just those 4 action steps. I want to turn the question to Dr. Matias. In your work, particularly in critical white studies, you talk about the ways folks may be complicit in racist structures, even when or if they go against their personal values or beliefs. So, what are ways that whiteness and anti-Blackness can be embedded even in this anti-racist work that we're trying to do?
Thank you so much. I just want to draw, because when Dr. Welton and Dr. Tuitt were talking, they were talking a lot about this piecemeal approach, and that, not in these words, but basically Dr. Tuitt saying, you know, diversity and inclusion in the universities are faking the funk. You're seeing this happen in K-12 schoolings in terms of, you know, culturally responsive teaching. It becomes, again, another faking the funk, you know? And so a lot of questions about how whites, even got some personal chats right here about how do whites get involved, and Dr. Tuitt talking about disinvestment in whiteness, and of course, because whiteness is such an investment in it that it actively promotes a disinvestment to Black ideologies, Black epistemology. So I think it's really important here. We're talking about, well, what's the problem here? I think the problem is folks don't know the true structure of what is going on here with respects to racism. In fact, when I was at UCLA, my professor used to tell me racism wasn't the problem, which almost near done all of us scholars of color. But he said, what the real issue here is that of white supremacy, and how that infiltrates all aspects. And if I could just take one moment here just to show one little slide. I have here a little thing, and this is from my first book, so you can grab it off here. But I think when we're talking about what can we do, the first thing we need to do is stop giving us checklists and look at the foundational issue here. Because if we do a little piecemeal, you know, or what I call, you know, Band-Aid policies, we're not actually getting at the root issue of white supremacy that thus impacts whites and people of color, albeit very differently. One, through the operations of whiteness, anti-Blackness being a strong element of whiteness, and racism impacting people of color through various dynamics from policing to microaggressions. Although we do know whiteness can impact people of color, albeit in a way of internalization via Frantz Fanon and the work that, in the psychoanalytic work that he does. So I just wanted to share that. And if these things are really impacting us in such a very strong way, the best, and I think Ricky Lee Allen talks about this, but the best whites can be, we're talking about, is anti-racist white racist. If we're looking at a position, and this, Dr. George Yancey talks about this in his New York op-ed on Dear White America, but Black racism is so embedded in the work that we do. I think it's really important to realize that as much as you personally want to engage in this, that someone will still benefit from it, you know, and therefore the best a white person can be is an anti-racist white racist. And it's a very deep word that I think people need to realize, that there is, I mean, we don't want to have the Eduardo Bonilla Silva where we have racism without racist, right? So the honest truth is we need to look at how whiteness is centering in such ways that it pushes everyone into the periphery in ways that makes it normalized to do so.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Matias, for that. So I want to go back to Dr. Welton. Dr. Welton, your work has discussed even how those who are anti-racist in their ideologies and practice can still sometimes face resistance by those seeking to uphold whiteness and maintain the racial status quo. What would you say to those who are looking for a safe way to critically examine and act upon policies that perpetuate educational and organizational inequity?
Well, I would say to that, my answer to that question would be that I don't think safety necessarily exists. This idea of safe spaces, you're going to have to be willing to engage in politics and get political as a white person. I think that the idea of safe spaces is, often created for white people, and to, make white people feel comfortable and engaging in discussions about race and white supremacy. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think we devote a lot of time in these discussions about race, racism, anti-racism, and white supremacy, devoting to white folks' care in these spaces. And so I think as a white leader, as a white person doing this work, I think you need to be open and upfront and about the power dynamics and racial hierarchies that exist in cross-racial dialogues, cross-racial anti-racist efforts. I think Dr. Matias is probably going to talk about that more as well. But I think in terms of a way in which white leaders can begin to critically examine how they perpetuate whiteness and white supremacy. I think those of us who work in preparation of leaders, I think we need to hold responsibility as well. I think we need to, for me who teaches in K-12 ed leadership, I think we need to do a better job of preparing our educational leaders to facilitate these discussions, to have a sense of criticality as well. In terms of how to maybe be more supported in doing this work, not necessarily safe, but feel more supported in doing this work. And this can be for white folks and for folks of color who are engaging in anti-racist work. I think you should not go do this work alone. I think you need to have community. I think you need to have coalition building. You need to build coalitions. You need to do the micro-political work. You need to develop your social and cultural capital and do this work with others. So then you can perhaps have that safety in numbers, so to speak, if that's the type of safety that you're looking for. I've seen a lot of, we're talking about promising practices and wanting like real examples in terms of how to have that safety of numbers, so to speak, in doing anti-racist work. I've seen a lot of really strong practices coming from community organizing, grassroots community organizing work. The work of Ann Ishamaru at the University of Washington, encouraging principals, school administrators to use community organizing practices and coalesce with the community when engaging in anti-racist work. So those are just some thoughts I have about safe spaces and maybe being more supported in doing this work versus feeling safe.
Sure. Thank you for that distinction of safety, because I think on campuses we use that idea a lot of times around safe spaces and things like that, when oftentimes these spaces may not actually be safe for Black folks. I do want to turn back to Dr. Matias. So Dr. Matias, we've seen instances in the news about how whiteness is often weaponized against Black people. And often this weaponization comes from those who consider themselves to be allies, or those who might even consider themselves to be woke. In your new book, Surviving Becky, you discuss the role of emotion and the replication of white supremacist structures, even in anti-racist efforts. How do seemingly anti-racist efforts sometimes lead to this weaponization?
Thank you so much. I think the weaponization can also be seen in what Dr. Welton's talking about, and the falsity of safe spaces, right? They're never safe. Issues of power are always circulating in that space. and therefore will exude itself. Unless we take an active step against it, we're going to continue like a treadmill, go with it, right? It's so, the complicity is already inherent, you know, because we live in such a society that constantly positively reinforces our complicity to it. Therefore, we have to really go against it. But I think there's two major issues with trying to do this coalition work and trying to engage in safe spaces or doing anti-racism, which I really think it's more, for me, racial justice work, in that the focus of me is dismantling white supremacy, which then structures everything else. So it's two things, which I wrote about in my first book. I know one of you were asking, and I do a lot, my focus is in teacher education, having been a classroom teacher, both in LA and New York for almost 10 years before I became a professor. We're seeing this happen in the K-12 schools that becomes violent to students. But two main things, I would say it's the emotionality of whiteness, you know, which my first book right here, someone was asking, it's Feeling White. And the second aspect, which is my next book that's coming up that I'm doing the call, is white liberalism, right? We're seeing how we're moving beyond this post-racial discourse, this colorblind discourse. So we're actually moving into a new realm where it's becoming this white liberal discourse. And although the intentions are there to engage in a really positive racial justice coalition building, it's just not there because the emotions are so weaponized that one's fragility, for lack of better words, or one seemingly sense of comfort is always focused on the norm of whiteness, right? And then it's always that catering, you know, aspect. So the work never really, in fact, I know there's an article on a Fanonian dialogue, on a Fanonian analysis on race dialogue. And it's basically folks of color to come away not knowing anything new, and whites are like, I've learned something after all the coddling happens, right? The second aspect of white liberalism is this shift, this evolved shift where it's like they've learned the liberal discourse, or in some of my publications, I call it the words of the vocabulary of civil rights, and they use it in such twisted, manipulated ways, reappropriated it, which then at the end just really supports whiteness and white supremacy yet again. So we have to really be careful when those of people who identify as white engage in this processes. They'll engage in liberal discourses that again promote anti-Black racism. So those are two aspects.
Thank you so much for that. You know, speaking of this, I wanted to move into something just a little bit different and have all of you expand a little bit further. I want to do some phrase association, because a lot of anti-Blackness can show up in white resistance to calls for anti-racism. And a lot of this shows up in our language and how we talk to each other about certain issues. So I'm going to say a phrase, and I'd love to hear each of the panelists' interpretations and comments on the phrase for our audience. So I'll start. Not all people are racist. Let's start with Dr. Tuitt.
Yeah, I start to get a little itch when I hear that. My reaction is we are all complicit in systemic racism. There's no way to divorce yourself from that. There are things that you can do to mitigate the violence that occurs as a result of systemic racism, but we all participate in racist systems, particularly in this US context for sure, and I would argue other parts of the world as well. And that statement there is one that makes my skin itch a little bit when I hear it.
Dr. Welton, what about you?
I mean, similarly, that was the same response that I had, is that, you know, we all participate and perpetuate a racist, you know, system. We all work within racist institutions. And so we are all in some way reproducing, you know, we all work at, right? We all work at predominantly white institutions, especially, you know, we're all in some way, perpetuating those racist practices. So, and white supremacy, as Dr. Matias said, to be the root of the problem. So I think it's impossible to try to divorce yourself and put somebody else off as a setup artist, so to speak.
Thank you. I'll start with the next phrase, and we'll start with you, Dr. Matias, is I don't feel like I'm being blamed. I feel like I'm being blamed for what prior generations did or what my ancestors did. How would you respond to that, Dr. Matias?
These are perfect examples of, I'm good at screen sharing, and please forgive me if I'm a teacher educator, so I believe in visuals, you know? So that just goes under what is the emotionality of whiteness. It's all these emotional exasperations that are expressed to assert, they're weaponized, right? They're used as a way to enforce the hegemonic dominance of whiteness, and they can be expressed in various ways. I think that phrase fits along with some of my publications, like, I've never owned slave. Why are you making me feel bad? Maybe you're just being so sensitive. These are all defensive mechanisms to really protect a deep sense of white ethnic shame. Is what Thandika writes in her book, Learning to be White, right? It becomes a way to engage in discourses that center whiteness. So if someone can say, you know, I feel like I feel like it was really sexist when they didn't take the only woman in the place. Then someone will just sidestep it by saying, well, what about men? It's like if you said, save the dolphins, and then they're like, well, what about the whales? You don't care about the whales? It's like, I'm not talking about that. Why are you fighting an argument where I'm talking about apples to talk about oranges? And the reason why is these emotionalities of whiteness are so deeply embedded to hide the white ethnic shame in such ways that it projects in very illogical and irresponsible ways. And so I think a lot of those phrases that you get, like all lives matter, I support Black lives, you know, all of that is just a way to defend whiteness because their emotionalities are so unfettered when they engage in the reality of what really whiteness is all about.
Thank you for that, Dr. Matias. I'll turn it back to Dr. Tuitt. Dr. Matias mentioned one of those phrases that we've seen in protests or counter-protests, all lives matter. What would you say to that phrase?
Yeah, I don't know that I have much more to add than what Dr. Matias has already said on this. I think if you go back to my original comments, we are trying to shift the focus away from dealing with addressing directly Blackness. And so we do that in so many different ways. And I think I'll point to my earlier example again around the ways we've thought about diversity and inclusion has really been, if we're being honest with ourselves, centered on whiteness. And so why would we use policies and programs and practices that are designed to focus on all people when we know that they miss specifically Black folks, right? And so, I mean, we don't have to look too far from the current context we're in related to COVID to see what happens when we do that. So yeah, I'm not sure there's much more to say on that one.
Yeah, Dr. Welton.
Yeah, I would just, like to add that those policies, laws and policies that happened in the past, I had nothing to do with that, but, we have suburbia, right? We have, we still have bastions of those policies that still, remain. Someone just put in the chat that still are represented today. And I don't really believe in the idea of unintended consequences of policies and laws. There is definitely a racial intent or an intent towards whiteness. It is intentional. And we are still experiencing the reverberations of those intended policies. Even current policies have an intent towards whiteness. I'm thinking here in Chicago public schools, selective enrollment policies and how those are basically, bastions for white elite to keep, white affluent folks in the district. So yes, these things are definitely intentional.
Can I add one I'm sorry,
Sure.
one that's just close, example that's close to my heart is the implementation of CDO roles, for example, and the ways in which these roles have been designed, right? And recently I've been doing some work tracing the history of the CDO role, connecting it to the plantation driver. And if you look at the responsibilities between those two roles, they're so similar in ways that are scary, right? And so we need to be critically conscious about the types of people, one, we put in these roles, and two, the expectations that we ask them to fulfill, because by and in and of itself, they're not going to inherently serve the dismantling of anti-Blackness unless there's some intentionality around how those roles are structured.
And so I appreciate what all of you have talked about, and ending with what Dr. Tuitt was saying about intentionality. I was reading an article the other day about there's a difference between being not racist and being anti-racist. And so I'd like to get your take on that, Dr. Matias, if I can.
Yes, hi, thank you so much. There's a lot of, I think the talk of intentionality is a big aspect, right? Anti-racist, I joke, I know we commonly joke around, but you know, I kind of like to assess other white folks. It's like, Becky, did you get your cousin? Honestly, show me how many white people you've got, and that's the intentionality. Not just shut them out of social media, not just not talk to them about race at the dinner table, but really how intentional are you in actually engaging in this, knowing that it's going to really unfetter some of the relationships that are built upon the comforts of whiteness. But at the same time, you're also modeling a more humanizing identity that really accepts humanity and Blackness in a way that maybe some people who are very close to you are not. And I know there's a lot of talk also on the side, you know, and I know Robin was talking about GI Bills, and yes, with respect to critical whiteness studies, you know, the notion that all these processes were intentional. I mean, in teacher education, I get this question, well, how do I diversify the teacher candidate pool? Because they make the claim that we just don't have teacher candidates of color. And I argue, well, why would why would folks of color want to be a teacher if teaching is so violent to students of color, right? And it's so complete with white. And we think about, you know, Brown v. Board, we think, yes, but the unintentional, or more apropos here, as Dr. Welton and Dr. Tuitt is saying, the more intentional consequence is that it really left all Black teachers jobless. Because when all Black students were bused into white communities, do you think they were gonna hire Black teachers to teach in Black and white integrated schools? Absolutely not. So this thing about, people are talking about tracking, the very essence, the way we talk about, you know, school resources. I was just talking to someone from Montgomery County in the greater DC, the DMV area, right? Talking about, well, we're trying to support my Black students. At the same time, he was doing these webinars, you know, and at the end of the day, he goes, it's not my Black students that have an issue. It's the white teachers who are teaching the Black students who have an issue. So it becomes a lot when we're talking about to be anti-racist is to have intentionality, to know that it'll shake up your core. And white folks always tell me, but I'm gonna lose a lot of my friends. Well, is that a bad thing? Because guess what? You're gonna get a lot more friends who are gonna see your true humanity. Stop performing to whiteness and you actually are liberated. In fact, when you think of white supremacy as impacting both whites and people of color, you understand, albeit differently, just like patriarchy impacts women and men, albeit differently, we understand how we're hogtied to this unbelievable system that is literally dividing us. It's nothing more than plantation politics, like as Dr. Tuitt said, when they're trying to get CDOs to just kowtow to all of their demands, right? And it just becomes lip service. We'll call it Oreos, we'll call it coconuts, we'll call it Uncle Tom's, whatever it becomes like a real life Black minstrel, right? If they're not gonna engage in the intentionality to dismantle these systems that have already pushed out so many Black faculty and students and Black epistemology. So absolutely.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Matias. That kind of moves me to Dr. Welton, because I know in your work, you discuss that anti-racists must have a, and I quote, strong anti-racist resolve to undo the inequitable influence of whiteness. What might that look like?
I feel like Dr. Matias kind of described that intentionality piece, what that anti-racist resolve must look like. I think we have discussed this pretty much in length, that actually I'm working on a paper right now with a doctoral student looking at white educational leaders, from principals to teacher leaders, who, you know, are attempting to engage in anti-racist practices, but when it comes to their actions, they still capitulate to whiteness, like in the moment, still capitulate to whiteness. And I think really needing to constantly, it's a lot of work, like constantly thinking about how, as a white person, even though you have that intention of being anti-racist, you are conditioned to protect your privilege. You are conditioned to protect whiteness. And every time you are making a decision, think about that decision that you're making. Like, am I truly making a decision that's going to dismantle whatever racist practice problem that I'm trying to redress? Or am I in some way still capitulating to whiteness and protecting my privilege? It's really going to take a lot of mental work. I also think coaching, I think we provide, we easily provide coaching for school leaders, for instructional leadership kinds of work, but I think we need to provide job embedded types of coaching for leaders, to help be that critical friend, help be that, to help them. Because it's in those everyday decision making, everyday actions, everyday practices where we forget how we're socialized and automatically are geared. White people are, people of color too. We can do things to protect whiteness, right? To maintain whiteness. How we just automatically capitulate to protecting whiteness. And so I go back to thinking about our preparation. I think we need to do a better job in leadership preparation programs to give school leaders the tools and the criticality to do that kind of really tough mental work, to think about how they've been socialized translates to their actions and to their everyday decisions.
Thank you for that. I was thinking about one of the questions that somebody put in the chat, and when we talked earlier about safe spaces, somebody put in about brave spaces, and but I had a thought that all of you have talked about the need for white anti-racists to be brave. A lot of times when we talk about brave space, it is the oppressed person or the person of color who is actually asked to be brave in these spaces, and yet we don't often ask the same thing of white folks in these spaces. And so that kind of leads me to my next question to Dr. Tuitt is, what are some common missteps that white anti-racists might make when trying to be allies to folks of color?
So thank you for that question. A couple of things that come to mind right off the top of my head is showing up when it's convenient to do so, showing up and automatically wanting to take control, showing up and allowing their fragility to take over the space. I mean, I could go on and on, but let me switch to the positive side, because I think what I've appreciated more, especially in the recent years around the white folks who have showed up in support of the movement for Black lives, in the ways in which they've showed up, already having done some of the necessary work to unpack their own privilege, to identify the ways in which they are complicit in systemic oppression, to learn about people other than themselves, and from a sort of social, cultural, intellectual perspective, doing that work. I've appreciated the way white folks have put their bodies on the line and to protect Black folks and other minoritized communities in the movements and in the protests, and ask for one, permission, two, how can they be most supportive in this work. So I think we've seen some recent examples around how to show up and be an actual accomplice in this work. I often push back on the notions of allyship, because it just has this really convenient ring to me that people tell you when they're going to be an ally, and that's all they have to do to be an ally, is tell you. So yeah, I like the way in which folks have been showing up in support of Black lives.
Thank you so much. Dr. Welton or Dr. Matias, would any of you like to give your perspectives? I'm so glad Dr. Tuitt mentioned this concept of allyship versus accomplice. And there are some folks who are now writing around that. Would either of you just jump in and give your thoughts to us in the audience?
I think, you know, with everything that's been going on within the last, gosh, has it been 2 months? Time is going by quickly. With the unfortunate death of lynching of George Floyd, there seems to be a lot of, you know, white folks who are newly awakened to issues of racism, and are asking, well, what should I do? How can I, you know, how can I help you? How can I do this work? And I think, number one, I can be exhausting a little bit to those of us who have been doing this work for a while. It's like, dang, you're just now getting it. But I think one thing you can do is, you know, folks of color have written the playbook. The playbook has been there. Like our work, you know, our actions, you know, what we put in writing, our scholarship. And so I think also honoring our work, going to our work, referencing our work, I think is really important too.
Thank you for that, Dr. Matias.
Absolutely. And like I said earlier, the biggest missteps is just to engage in your white emotionality, the need, not just they come into a space knowing that that they need to have the privilege and their emotions intact. At the same time, they also have this idea where I feel like people of color need to coddle it all the time. And if I'm feeling certain, this expectation, you know, those type of expectations in catering white emotionality, and of course white liberalism, you know, really making sure that you're not using the discourse against us. But yeah, and I want to echo Dr. Welton's word, because, you know, it's like, welcome to the party, you know, but the party started 2 hours ago, right? Like, and then you're not even, and then you're gonna bogart being the host, like, welcome everyone to the party. It's like, what? You know, it's like, so that's the kind of sentiment. It's like, and even particularly for Black and women of color, it's like the lack of citation and the lack of, you know, credit for the work that we've been doing. And this is not just like, I know people are doing it because, and I'm really happy that they're having change of heart, change of mind, change of spirit, change of soul, wonderful. At the same time, there are people who put their soul, their heart in this work and have undergone, like I know with respects to me, and I'm pretty sure this happens to my colleagues, the amount of hate mail I get, the amount of threats, the amount of ostracism I got, you know, with respect to the work that I did. You know, so I think this is really important when whites join this. And I'm not only saying whites, because, you know, there are a few people of color who are finally like, it's like, where have you been? Like, oh, Black's Lives Matter. I'm like, hello? You know, again, party started 2 hours ago. So it's just really, you know, it could be disheartening. It's heartening to see this mass support. Absolutely. But it's a Pyrrhic victory in some sense, because, and I see it with my own family, I see it with my own friends, I see it here in Los Angeles, for non-Black people of color, you know, it's like to claim Black Lives Matter, it's wonderful, but at the same time, it's like, what the hell were you thinking before? And I just want to say, because holding on to Blackness is like a skewed form of paying homage to an inhumane process of whiteness, right? Like, that's the last bastion that they were hoping to hold. Like, I want to hold on to the house slave status, or the coyote status, or the field whip status, to have some semblance of hope that I might be accepted in a white supremacist world. And, you know, at the end of the day, not to be glib, but injustice for one is injustice for all, right? So I'm really hoping that people, whites and other people, non-Black people of color, and even other Black folk, you know, who are finally, because we know not everyone thinks the same, right? When they actually start to engage in an anti-Black, more what I call in critical whiteness, because critical whiteness studies has its own different roots too. I call it a Black whiteness studies, right? That type of work is more humanizing. And how much more peaceful is that to engage in something that binds the liberation to someone else's? And this whole notion of being a co-conspirator, a co-accomplice, whatever the terminology, but it's like, it's no different from saying, look, in any relationship where you're truly loving, you're truly bonding, and their hope and happiness and sadness are bound to your hope and sadness. So it's no different.
Thank you for that. That kind of moves me into a next question. So, you know, Dr. Welton, I appreciated you saying that, you know, and Dr. Matias, you echoed this, where have you been? When I even point out to people the amount of work that has been happening for hundreds of years around this. We aren't the first authors of this kind of stuff. We aren't the first researchers. I love Ida B. Wells and her work. And so, you know, where have you been, or how much more do you need to know before you begin this anti-racist work? And so that was one of the things we wanted to do with this webinar series, but particularly this one, is that you know all you need to know to get started in becoming anti-racist, right? Even if you make missteps, even if you don't feel like you have it all right, you have all you need to know to begin to treat people with dignity and to begin to engage in humanizing ways, as Dr. Matias talked about. My next question is we've seen a lot of racial repositories being built and about racial justice. Where can you go to read about this? And so a lot of these resources do teach us about racism and white supremacy and anti-Blackness. But one thing I was thinking about is the need for counter stories to all of that. Where are the counter stories in these resources that people are asking for? And so, Dr. Matias, I know you write about the importance of counter stories. So while there's a need to be educated around issues of racism and anti-Blackness, it's important to have counter stories to counter negative ideas and stereotypes and biases surrounding Black folks. Talk to us a little bit about the need for that.
So drawing on my work with critical race theory and its applications of counter stories as a methodology, as well as counter narratives that's coming even further back from Danny Solorzano and Derek Bell's work. It's the point here is that it's countering something, right? It's a story that is, it's not held on its own, but it's held on the notion that it's been silenced and marginalized. And it's trying to combat what they call in critical race theory, the majoritarian story, right? Or in history, though, using transdisciplinary approaches, I think they call it, oh man, I don't know, like the master narrative, right? Sorry, I hear my kids fighting on the other side. I'm like trying to text him, be quiet. But yeah, so we're seeing this when we're talking about counter narratives, and I think it's really important not only that people start to hear. It's no different from like slave narratives, like hearing this. Right? We need to hear the voices of most of those most marginalized. So if we're studying patriarchy, we need to hear about women. When we're studying about the intersections of race and gender, then we need to hear about women, Black and other women of color, and how they're experiencing the processes of race and gender upon them. When we're studying about whiteness and white supremacy and its deleterious impact of people of color, then we really need to understand that. So, counter stories do a great job of doing that. Yet at the same time, I caution, because as my role as a professor, I've noticed that sometimes we can engage in the identity politics. I am woman, therefore I can attest to this. That's not the case that we're saying here. Counter stories are just that. It's a counter to an acknowledgement of a larger systemic structure that is then impacting the story, right? It structures the story. So it's not just playing identity politics saying, I am a person of color, therefore I can speak this, but it's also knowing the ideological parameters for which makes it a counter story, right? So I think I want to be cautious. Yes, we do need to hear, but not everyone's counter story is a counter story. May I be very frank? Candace Owens is not a counter story. I'm just going to be real with you. So we need to be very critical. Yes, is she a Black woman? Does she experience what it is to be Black? Yeah, you can't rub that off your skin, right? But again, the ideology must be there to have the intellectual astuteness, may I say, to deconstruct how your story is counter to a larger systemic phenomenon. You don't have it there, you're just you become, like I always say, it's Black neutral, it's blackface using Black bodies, you know? And so it's really, we must be very careful when we engage in counter stories.
Thank you. And so I'd like to pose the question to our other panelists, Dr. Welton and Dr. Tuitt. One of the audience members asked, what are good and bad examples of counter stories if there's time for us to talk about that. And so we do have a little bit of time before we move into the Q&A session. I think Dr. Matias gave us one example, right? You know, I just had an email exchange with somebody where I said, I hate it when people cherry pick certain Black people to talk about certain things. And they know that certain Black people will affirm their ideologies and put this type of information out. And so we were having an exchange about a particular news article. Yeah, but if I could turn it over to Dr. Tuitt and Dr. Welton, what are some of these examples of good and bad counter stories?
I mean, I think Dr. Matias hit it on the head with the example. But I think, you know, even our, you know, esteemed leaders, like our former president, Barack Obama, can participate in white liberal discourses that can be very problematic and dangerous for our communities. And I think that needs to be acknowledged, recognized as well. Sometimes even more dangerous, because if you're searching for someone who's going to fulfill your agenda, that can be even more dangerous and more problematic in some respects.
Thank you.
Love
Dr.
our former president, miss him, but
Yes.
you know, just
Absolutely.
we can as well participate in white liberal narratives that, as Dr. Matias said, are the counter narrative and are just perpetuating the master narrative.
Thank you, Dr. Tuitt.
Yeah, just I think it's been covered quite well. I'm a proponent of counter stories, counter narratives. I encourage my students to develop them as a writing assignment. I'm typically pushing them to think about, excuse me, what their theory of racism is in that counter narrative. So it's being clear about what it's being countered to, as has already been said. And then also, I think the ones that work well for me are able to be intentional about the theory of change as well. So, so there's a deconstruction of something and a reconstruction of something in that counter narrative that works well. Those are the things that I look for.
Okay, thank you. I think one of the things that resonates with me around this is that we will often do news stories or write articles about the effects of racism, about oppression. And so where are the counter narratives that show Black joy? Where are the counter narratives that affirm us as a people? We're not just people who experience oppression. We're not just victims of something. And so for me, even with these types of resources, I want to see more that offers a counter narrative or a counter story, or that push back on these notions. Many people, as folks of color, they don't see us as experiencing success or joy, and so thank you all for responding to that. So now we want to move in and try to address a few of the questions that we have, and I'm just going to kind of look at my screen here and some of the questions that Dr. McMillian pushed forward. So there are some questions about if folks are wanting to sort of get started on the road to being anti-racist. Particularly one that was asked about folks in schools or as pre-service educators or even in their institutions. How do they begin to lay the groundwork for anti-racist practices? And I can start with either one of you. How about we start with you, Dr. Welton?
I think the first way to lay the groundwork is to be committed. I know it's not like, oh, give me an add water stir of how to do this, but I think being committed. Are you committed to doing this work? Like, seriously ask yourself, are we demonstrating commitment? Are we demonstrating accountability for the long haul, not just the short term? This isn't something that we just, check, did my anti-racism today. So I think the first question is to ask is, are you committed? And what are you doing and what are you putting into place to make sure that you remain committed, stay committed, are accountable to being committed. to doing that work. And I think that, you know, what that looks like will be very different, I think, based on your context. But also don't let whiteness keep you, delay you from doing the work, right? Don't let the resistance, pushback, and all that other stuff that gets in the way, don't let that delay you from starting the commitment, because that is what it is designed to do.
Thank you, Dr. Matias.
After being in teacher education and being a classroom teacher for almost 25 years, despite the fact that I still look 25. No, I think the biggest pull, if you go into teacher education, every year I get a lot of teacher candidates that always name 3 things as to why they get into the field of teaching. One, they love kids. They say they love kids, right? So I'm like, you know, let's interrogate love, because, you know, pedophiles love kids too. I'm just being realistic. Where does your framing of love come? You know, a lot of them do this, I want to give back. You know, and then they'll use the white liberal discourse where it's like, you know, I understand that there's disparities in communities, having grown up in a white community that have access to they have the good liberal discourse. And then they'll say, I want to give back. But the question is, what has made you morally so guilty such that now you feel compelled to give back? What is it that you have so wrongfully stolen such that now you want to give back to a community you've never even been in, right? So there's a lot of embedded emotionality and psyche already inoculated in the whole field of teacher education. I myself I'm guilty of this. I mean, going through a teacher ed program, you know, today, you know, I had my professor come in with a sombrero and maracas, and she was like, today we're going to learn about multicultural reading literacy. And I was like, you know, we're so inoculated with this, right? So in order to start with pre-service and K-12 teacher, we need to rip that dangerous mind, freedom writer, Ron Clark. So I'm going to put the help in there. I'm going to put, you know, the blind side. We need to rip that emotional attachment to an emotional narrative that always puts whites as the savior, despite the fact they don't even know what they're saving, right? And so I think that's the first aspect. And that's where I talk about the white emotionality. They need to first deconstruct this love for teaching. What do you mean a love for teaching? What do you mean I love kids? What do you mean I care for kids? What do you mean you want to give back? All that, I know it sounds very rudimentary, but where are you coming from with that emotional epistemological framework such that then you feel your actions adhere to it? Because it becomes more narcissistic when you're just trying to support a fundamental flaw that you feel deep within you, and then you can tell everyone, but I'm an urban school teacher. You know, it becomes a way to just placate your own sense of immorality, right? So we need to go back to the very white emotionalities that structure teacher education. And then when we go into teacher, I'm so tired of reading other teacher educator researchers who are these white saviors. They're the experts of Black student pipelines, you know, Latinx student pipelines. And I'm like, Leo, can you hear from our own folks for a little bit about how we engage? Because when Sonia Nieto conceptualized multicultural ed, right? When James Banks and Sonia Nieto conceptualized that. When Geneva Gay conceptualized culturally responsive teaching. When Gloria Ladson-Billings conceptualized culturally relevant teaching. When all these folks are culturally sustaining by Django Paris, right? The notion of racism and white supremacy was ever present, yet it gets trickled down and watered down through teacher education and its sick marriage with whiteness, such that it becomes just this salsa-like education where they just add it on the side. You know, they put the sombrero and the maracas, and then we're all clapping that they did their job. So I think it's really important that, you know, when we engage in this work with K-12 schools, and we need to rip that ideological idea from our entire framework of how we see teaching.
Thank you for this. I really appreciate you, Dr. Matias, just touching on, how most teachers talk about they love, love students, but that love is conditional in many ways to conforming to certain structures that isn't actually love for Black folks or Black children or children of color. And so we did have a question, Dr. Tuitt, just you expounding on something that you said earlier about, in many ways, how the work of the Chief Diversity Officer is structured. And so one of our audience members wanted you to expound on that further.
Sure. So in a recent publication that I'm working on, I draw comparisons between the Chief Diversity Officer and the plantation driver. And in particular, I highlight some of the roles related to how we are used to suppress campus protests, for example, how we're used to respond to faculty grievances, particularly from racially minoritized faculty or staff, how we're used as a buffer to really prevent or protect the institution in ways that are helpful to the institution and serve to further reinforce whiteness. And I think if you're not careful, and I'll put on my other hat as an educator, just to as a professor, just to give an example. All my work is about race and equity, right? And I'm very intentional about that. And even in some of the classes, I had to stop and look at my syllabus, or my syllabi as I looked across them, to see that actual titles that reference Blackness were becoming less and less in the readings I was requiring, right? So if someone who thinks about this on a 24-hour basis can do that, right? If we're not careful, right, it's easy to get seduced. Sarah Ahmed talks about the happy talk of diversity, happy talk of inclusive excellence. It's easy for us to get seduced by these if we're not constantly committing to a anti-racist lens to think about this work. And so CDOs are now being challenged to think about diversity of perspective and diversity of thought. And so the more things you add to those roles, the further away we get from addressing racism. And I think, and that's not to say that racism is the only thing that we should be paying attention, but I guarantee if institutions, and I will say CDOs, which I'm one of, if we had done a better job in staying committed to centering race, we wouldn't find ourselves in the positions we are now, having to respond. And so those are just some of the ways in which I think we have to move from managing diversity to dismantling racism.
Gosh, thank you for that. I'm writing that down, actually. And I think it's particularly helpful for a lot of people in the audience who have been asking questions. I see a lot of people who have self-identified as white and feeling like, do I need to step out of the way? Or, and so I think having a focus like you have just talked about, Dr. Tuitt, it's not so much about managing your own identity or managing diversity per se, but actually just changing your mindset to that we need to be dismantling something. And anybody can do that work, so I think that was really important point that you made. I want to give each of you just the last word is before we log off is what is one thing that you would like to leave our listeners with? Let's start with you, Dr. Welton.
I mean, that's great that you're hyped up in this moment about doing anti-racist work. But I want to know, check in with yourself a month from now, check in with yourself 6 months from now, check in with yourself and your colleagues a year from now, and assess and critique your level of commitment to doing this work. Because I think as many people have been saying, Dr. Linda Tillman, one of our mentors, talked about this not being a moment and it being a movement, and, consistently assessing your level of commitment and sustaining and maintaining and doing this work. So I just think, please, white folks, folks of color, do that continuous self-assessment with yourself, but also with your colleagues. Are you committed to this for the long haul?
Thank you, Dr. Welton. Dr. Matias?
Hi, and yes, for those of you that are asking, the book that Dr. Tuitt was referencing that I was holding up, I was Vanna Whiting on Being Included by Sarah Ahmed. And she does a lot of work on the cultural politics of emotions, in which I draw a lot of my work with the emotionality of whiteness. So I think at the end, people are always trying to, do a checklist, particularly for white folks. They're trying to find out, well, checklist, what should I do? What should I do? Because I don't want to be looked at as racist. I think you have, and then if we think of it in that ways, we're never going to fully embed ourselves and immerse ourselves into racially just types of policies and racially just life. And so if you think about it this way, it's like kind of like when your girlfriend is venting, something that happened to her, you don't stop and, you don't do the man thing, say, well, did you do this? Or try to solve the problem or any of that. You don't have to bogart her pain. You don't trauma porn her pain and tell everyone else, right? You listen. You say, that's right. What a bitch. You're just at that point, being there with the moment, right? And learning how this is not an addition thing that you do. This is something that you can do therapeutically to engage as a better human being. If you notice your friends don't want to talk to you about or vent their issues, it's because you cut them off. It's because you don't listen, because you're always trying to find solutions. You're always trying to say, well, maybe you shouldn't, maybe you're just being sensitive about the situation. Don't do that to your friends. So don't do that to people of color. How's that? There's no checklist on how to deal with Black folks, in as much as there's no checklist how to deal with your mama, who literally is texting me right now about my bum hip, and how it's all my fault. I mean, I'm not gonna talk back to my mama. So don't talk back to some people who are saying certain things that they have expertise to do. So for those white folks, for people of color, I think one thing I'll say for you is continue to survive, continue to smile. Racism doesn't, yes, it has impacted our lives, but how much Black beauty is there? How much brown beauty is there? We can live, as Baldwin says, independent of whiteness. Whiteness cannot live independent of us. Therefore, continue and know that just living and being, like my best friend's always saying, I feel like I need to do more. I'm like, girl, you raising 2 Black boys. Actually, you're raising 2 Black Blasian boys, And so do what you got to do, just focus on that. And then for whites who are going to stop looking for checklists, I'm thankful that you're reading. Do it. Do it because it's meaningful to you as a human being. And then at the end of the day, don't look for the checklist. Don't ask, what can I do? Just ask. Just be a friend, a good human being friend. And that's what it is at the very end of the day.
Thank you for that. Dr. Tuitt?
Oh, I love the reminders that this is not a moment, but needs to be a movement, and that we need to stop trying to triangulate, validate, interrogate expressions of harm as a result of engagement with racism. There's this tendency for folks to want to try to confirm that it really happened instead of honoring that someone's humanity's been attacked and violated, and that should be first and foremost. So stop having that tendency to want to do that. I think the other thing I've been thinking a lot about and still trying to get better with is this notion of grace, that the institutions we're trying to dismantle have hundreds of years of experience perfecting their whiteness, and for us to think we're going to be able to dismantle it quickly with a single protest or a current movement. It's not. This is in for the long. We got to be in for the long run. So
Hundreds of years in the making. This is hundreds of years in the making. It's going. Yes, it takes time. Yep.
Absolutely. And I keep reminding myself and others that this needs to be a labor of love, where we are prioritizing self-care and resiliency, and that we are no good to the movement if we don't take care of ourselves. And so I'm thinking about how we institutionalize notions of self-care and resiliency in our day-to-day life in these traditionally white institutions. So those are two things I would hope folks would continue to think about as they move from this session. And thank you for hosting this event.
No, thank all of you. And I want to thank our panelists and again, Dr. Quay, Dr. McMillian, and Dr. Lori Patton Davis, and also just the audience. And thank you all for the panelists for leaving on that powerful note. And, in honor of my background on this Zoom, Congressman John Lewis, he talked about it being a movement of a lifetime. It's not just a year or a day or something like that. And those of you who are thinking about pursuing anti-racist stances or practices, there's no end point that you get to, like, oh, all of a sudden I'm an anti-racist. It's continual work, probably across your lifetime, to being anti-racist. So there's no end point that you get to and this work is over. So thank you all again for joining us today. Thank you again to our panelists. I took lots of notes just for myself with some of the things that you were saying. And to the audience, we hope you will join us for our final webinar in this series next Wednesday at the same time. And Dr. Lori Patton Davis will be our moderator for that one. And again, thank you all and have a great rest of the week.